Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Perhaps one of the most famous sets of ideas in Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit occur in paragraphs 186 to 189. This is what we call the struggle to the death or the battle to the death. And it happens right before and leads into the famous master-slave dialectic, but is not actually part of that dialectic proper. So what is going on there, and why does Hegel think that self-consciousnesses are going to inevitably clash in this non-cooperative, agonistic struggle? Well, it's important to keep in mind here that Hegel is not saying that this is the case for all self-consciousnesses whatsoever. This happens at a very early stage, and then it's superseded. The German word for that is aufheben, right, or aufgehoben. We also can translate as transcended, integrated into higher and higher structures. But early on in the phenomenology, there is this struggle to the death for the two consciousnesses. So let's chart out how this takes place for Hegel. You notice I've got a diagram here that we can consult to some degree. So what is going on in this? He says self-consciousness is seeking the truth of its self-certainty. Each of the self-consciousnesses which confront each other, which run into each other, are doing so as living individuals. So one living individual confronts another living individual. They are both self-consciousnesses. As we've talked about elsewhere, the very nature of self-consciousness is not to simply be what it is entirely in isolation by itself, but through another self-consciousness. And recognition is really at the core of what we're looking for as self-consciousnesses, according to Hegel. So each of them is seeking some sort of recognition from the other. And each of them realizes that the other is another self who can think like them, who can act like them. If I look at the other person and say, I'm kind of hostile to them, I bet they could be hostile to me. Or I desire them, perhaps they desire me. There's that mutuality that's going on. So Hegel says that there's kind of an ambiguity here in how the self and the other are being understood. He says, what is other for self-consciousness is an unessential, negatively characterized object on the one hand, but the other is also a self-consciousness. And so he says they are for each other like ordinary objects, independent shapes, individuals submerged in the being or immediacy of life. They confront each other as living animals, in each other's fields of perception. And yet at the same time, they also are for each other something deeper than that. And you could say, well, why can't they simply, agree that they'll just give each other recognition and maybe build a nice hut together in these primitive conditions and just get along? Why do they have to come into a conflict with each other? So for Hegel, this has to do with really two things. One is, as he says, they are for each other shapes of consciousness which have not accomplished the movement of absolute abstraction, rooting out all immediate being purely the negative being of self-identical consciousness. They have not exposed each other, themselves to each other in the form of pure being for self or self-consciousness. And then he follows up this rather abstract way of talking by saying something that's a lot easier to relate to. Each indeed is certain of its own self, but not of the other, and therefore its own self-certainty still has no truth. It has some grasp, some immediate grasp of who it is, who I am, but the recognition that I'm getting from the other, I can't be completely certain about what that means. Only if I can abstract away all the determinate things that are confronting me, the things that make me a living being in this case, and make the other a living being who's an individual, coming from this place, this time, speaking this language, with this set of desires. Only if I can confront them, you might say, qua human being, can I attain the truth of the certainty that I am looking for. And then I'll be truly certain of myself. I will have attained recognition. Now, this entire process that's happening on my side, if I'm the self, is also happening on the side of the other. And I am the other to that self over there. So both of these selves are going to be looking at each other in a way that's sketched out here. How do we get to them seeking death at this point? So before that, Hegel says, and this is good to dwell on, according to the notion of recognition, this recognition is only possible when each is for the other what the other is for it. Only when each in its own self, through its own action, and again through the action of the other, achieves this pure abstraction of being for self, this pure self-relation. So how would one do that? Hegel goes on and he says, this consists, and here we get to the second point, in showing that I'm not attached to any particular existence, any particular Dasein is actually how he's using it. Any particular being in this place, in this time, being who I am with these features, this history, to attain a kind of independence. So he says, not to the individuality common to existence as such that is not attached to life. And then he says, this is happening on both sides. This is action on the part of the other and action on its own part. So he says, insofar as it is action of the other, each seeks the death of the other. Each goes after the other and tries to eradicate them. Not just threaten them, but to kill them. Here's where it gets even more interesting. Insofar as it's the action of the self, it's also at the same time a risking of death, a placing one's own life, one's own who one is, into the balance. And Hegel says that what we have here is both of these individuals prove themselves and each other through a life and death struggle. And he says they must engage in this struggle. Why can't they evade it? Well, because they must raise their certainty of being for themselves to truth, both in the case of the other and in their own case. They need to dominate the other in a certain sense, and the ultimate domination is through death in this case, in order to be certain of themselves. Now, there's a kind of paradox here. Right? So on the one hand, only by throwing themselves entirely into the breach, as we say, and risking everything, can they attain the ultimate goal, which is this fundamental recognition. But on the other hand, they are themselves not just risking death for themselves, they are also risking the death of the other. What happens if the other dies? Actually, let's start by considering the situation in which both of them die. If both of them die, no meaning whatsoever, right? As far as these two individuals are concerned, because they're gone. They did risk everything, indeed. But if they both die, there is no dialectical advance. There's nobody to be certain about anything in that case, let alone have a true certainty. What if one of them dies? Well, you can't really get recognition from a corpse, can you? We have to risk death in this dynamic But if we actually attain death, the dynamic is over. So there's an interesting paradoxicality to this. So this is why Hegel will say this trial by death does away with the truth which was supposed to issue from it, and so too with the certainty of self generally. Death shows that each staked his life and held it of no account, both in himself and the other, but that is not for those who survived this struggle. They are transformed in the process. Now, Hegel does not consider the case, interestingly enough, where perhaps both of them risk death and neither of them die. Instead, what he's going to talk about is one of the self-consciousnesses. It's almost like a big game of chicken, in a way. If you're not familiar with chicken, it's a game here that we played in the Americas, and it can be done in a number of ways. So the archetypal way is to have two vehicles being piloted, and they're approaching each other at high speed, and they're going to have a collision, and whoever turns aside to avoid the collision is the chicken, and the other person goes on and they get, the wreath and laurels and, oh, you're a tough guy and all that sort of stuff. And from a Hegelian perspective, they get to feel that they have conquered. They are the champion, right? And you can do this in a number of different ways. When we talk about calling somebody's bluff or, escalating things, who's willing to go to the ultimate? Well, in this case, the ultimate is death. And so in these two self-consciousnesses, these two living individuals, one possibility is that one of them caves. Indeed, Hegel seems to think that if neither of them cave, one of them is going to die or both of them are going to die. So he goes on and he says, death shows that each staked his life and held it of no account, both in himself and the other. But this is not for those who survive the struggle. They put an end to their consciousness in its alien setting of natural existence. That is, they put an end to themselves and are done away with as extremes wanting to be for themselves, to have an existence of their own. But with this, there vanishes from their interplay the essential moment of splitting into extremes. The middle term collapses into a lifeless unity. They do not reciprocally give and receive one another back from each other consciously, but leave each other free only indifferently like things. What could keep this from happening? What leads into the master-slave dialectic? One of these consciousnesses loses the game of chicken. One of these consciousnesses gives in. Hegel says, in this experience, self-consciousness learns that life is essential to it as pure self-consciousness. When he says life, he doesn't just mean being alive, he means its determinate life. In my case, being Greg Sadler here, 46 years old, about to turn 47, with such and such a history. All of that is part of my individuality, my life, right? And I learn the meaning, the fuller meaning of it. In Hegelian terms, I am more for myself. I understand my being for myself. Through risking that life, through risking that existence. Now, what if somebody gives in? What if somebody says, I love my life more than being a pure self-consciousness, somebody who can be totally assured of who and what they are? Well, that person is going to become what Hegel is calling the slave, or another translation, the bondsman, the knecht, right? So he says, what happens here is that, here we go, both moments are essential to begin with. They are unequal and opposed. Their reflection into unity has not been achieved. They exist as two opposed shapes of consciousness. One is the independent consciousness whose essential nature is to be itself, to be for itself. The other becomes a dependent consciousness. Why dependent? Because it gives in. Because it values its life more than its own independence, more than its own certainty of who it is, more than recognition from the other. So the one becomes the master or the lord. The other becomes the slave or the bondsman. And now we can move into the master-slave dialectic.